Is the war between Israel and the Palestinians a containable and isolated event, or is it the start of a dark path that might lead us to World War III? I've been thinking about this for months now, and I can't help but notice that the events leading up to World War I eerily resemble the dynamics of the war in Gaza right now. This doesn't necessarily mean that we are at the beginning of a global war. Predicting the course of a war is not an easy task, and if it's even possible, I wouldn't be the one to do it. In this video, we'll take a look at the events leading up to World War I in order to better understand what's going on in Gaza right now. We'll try to figure out if we're at the start of a world war and what this war tells us about the dynamics of the China-US relationship. World War I was supposed to be the war that ended all wars. It was such a momentous event that even at the start of the war, people understood that it was a big shift in the global architecture of power. World War I led to the demise of four great empires: the German Empire, the Romanov Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It led to 11 European countries transforming into dictatorships, and most importantly, it led to a shift in the center of global power from Europe to the United States. When you look a bit deeper, you find that World War I was actually about the ascent of the German Empire and how it threatened the British Empire's global dominance. In the 18th century, Britain initiated the first industrial revolution, which was based on iron, steam, textiles, and more. This led to Britain gaining a big technological edge that allowed it to dominate other regions in order to become the most powerful country in history. The Germans subsequently initiated the Second Industrial Revolution, which was based on steel, internal combustion engines, and chemicals. This led to the German Empire surpassing the British in industrial and commercial power by the end of the 19th century. Here are some numbers that can help put things into perspective. In 1860, the British Empire held 59% of global wealth, and the German Empire had only 3%. By 1913, Germany had 21% of global wealth, and Britain had 14%. Such a big reversal of fortunes was unheard of back then. It made the British uneasy about the Germans, fearing that the Germans would threaten their hold on power on the European continent and beyond. They felt as if they needed to do something about it, so they went to war. The Chinese have been on a similar trajectory in recent decades. In 1980, the US was responsible for 21% of global economic output, while China was responsible for only 2%. That's a 10-to-1 advantage for the US. By 2022, their roles had completely reversed, with China on an upwards trajectory. It is now responsible for 21% of global economic output, while the US produces 15% of global economic output. Keep in mind that this gap will probably keep growing. The Chinese economy is now entering a bit of a rough patch, but that's probably going to be a temporary dip, comparable to the US depression in the early 30s. It's going to be tough, but they're gonna grow out of it. The reversal of industrial might is simply stunning and undeniably similar to the dynamics between Britain and Germany before World War I. The US is highly aware of this, and so they're becoming obsessed with China. As US Secretary of State Antony Blinken once said, "China is the only nation that has both the means and the intent to challenge US leadership of the global order." But you might think, what does China have to do on anything? It's in no way involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. So is the war in Gaza going to lead to World War III? Not necessarily. Even if all the conditions are present, there still needs to be a trigger that draws everyone into the conflict. Gaza could be that trigger, the same way the murder of Archduke of Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand, triggered World War I. Let's zoom in a little bit. If the war in Gaza expands into Lebanon, or even worse, if it turns into a direct confrontation between Iran and the US, Iran's allies Russia and China might feel the need to intervene in order to avoid the US gaining a foothold in one of the last bastions of resistance against the US. The thing is, I don't see a US invasion of Iran happening right now, after the dramatic ending of Iraq and Afghanistan. 2 decades after the US toppled Saddam Hussein, after trillions of dollars have been spent to win the war, Iraq is now an Iranian puppet state. 2/3 of Iraqi oil production is now facilitated by the Chinese, by companies like the National Petroleum Corporation and PetroChina. The US gained absolutely nothing from Iraq, except removing Saddam Hussein from power. Afghanistan was an even bigger waste of time after spending trillions to get the Taliban out of power. The Taliban moved back into Kabul just days after the US left the country. Keep in mind, we're talking about people living in caves, fighting a guerrilla war against the most powerful country in the world. The US still lost that war. The US is highly aware of this. They don't want to spend trillions again to fight a war in the Middle East that they're going to gain absolutely nothing from, especially if that means using up resources that could be deployed to keep China in check. Again, the US is too obsessed with China right now to be engaged with Iran. Besides, the whole reason the US initiated the Abraham Accords was in order to stabilize the Middle East so it could assure its main ally Israel that its region could make do with less US support. So in my opinion, the US is going to do whatever it takes to avoid being dragged into another conflict in the Middle East. So if the war in Gaza is not going to lead to World War III, what other geopolitical ramifications can it have? According to Robert Freeman, we're looking at something much more similar to the Suez Crisis. The Suez Crisis was a conflict in 1956 that ended the British Empire. After Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, the UK enlisted France and Israel to invade Egypt and secure the channel. Eisenhower wasn't having any of this, so he threatened to crash the British pound if the UK went ahead. The UK ended up ducking its tail between its legs and pulling back. It was a moment of peak humiliation for the UK, a country that once boasted that the sun never set on its empire. The UK never really recovered from this humiliation, and they've been following the US around like a groupie ever since. This has caused it to lose its diplomatic credibility as a superpower, after already losing its economic and military edge. Something similar is happening to the US right now. After losing its economic and military credibility, it's now losing its diplomatic credibility. Let's look at these three elements of power projection one by one in order to understand why the US has reached the peak of its superpower status. Number 1. Economic decline. The decline of US economic power relative to China, as discussed earlier, is a clear sign to the rest of the world that it is slowly but surely trending downward. Add to that the fact that China has pulled more people out of poverty than the combined population of North America. And that's without starting any wars like the US has done the last century. All of this is going on while China has been building factories like no country has done before, providing jobs to hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens. Meanwhile, the US has been outsourcing jobs as fast as China has been producing them. Outsourcing industrial jobs has been amazing for shareholder wealth in the US, but it has hollowed out its industrial base that the country has been built on, leading to rust belts, extreme rises in poverty, and related problems like drug use and gun violence. Not to mention the political ramifications of the economic decline and the rise of leaders that are less capable of strategic long-term alliance thinking. And so these are the symptoms of the US economic decline. Number 2 is military decline. As mentioned earlier, US military dominance is slowly but surely fading away. Let me be clear, the US still has the most capable and most advanced military out there. But it has become increasingly clear that US leaders haven't been able to yield that power as effectively as they could, leading to an erosion of its power projection and its coalition building capabilities. And so these are the symptoms of US economic decline. The United States has been distracted with wars in the Middle East for decades, while the Chinese have been slowly building up their military capabilities. The US is highly aware of this, so it's going to do whatever it can to avoid being dragged into another war that it gains nothing from but costs a lot. The US's enemies are seeing this happen in front of their own eyes, so they're showing more assertive behavior without the fear of retaliation. The attack of shipping lanes by the Houthis is a great example of this. The Houthis know America is not going to commit to a long ground invasion, so they keep attacking ships, knowing that the US and its allies will not go further than firing some cruise missiles. And so all of these developments are showing that the US military credibility is in decline. Number 3. Diplomatic decline. When China pulled off a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia in 2023, it showed off its rising diplomatic strength in the Middle East, a territory where the United States has been the most important power broker for a century. The rapprochement was one of the main blows to the US position in the region. The same year, Saudi Arabia announced that it would be selling oil to China in its own currency, the yuan, which would be a direct assault by the largest oil exporter in the world on the US most prized asset, the US dollar. Saudi Arabia has also recently ignored pleas from Biden to lower oil prices by ratcheting up production, while also burying the hatchet with Bashar al-Assad, Russia's Syrian ally. All of these examples of the US losing key diplomatic battles are the direct result of wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, which have led to war fatigue among the US elite. The downward spiral of US diplomatic strength is not as clear to anyone because it's happening very slowly over decades with isolated events with years in between them. But all of these events are slowly eroding away the US's position as the global hegemon. And so these are the three pillars that US power is based on, or that of any other hegemon for that matter. Economic power, military power, diplomatic power. And these are all in decline in the US, showing that the US is slowly but surely fading away as the global hegemon. Israel is highly aware of this. It knows it can't keep counting on the US for much longer, especially if the US ends up in a conflict with China. Erosion of US power means that Israel needs to act fast in order to secure the borders that it wants. As the first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, once said, "The Arabs will have to go, but one needs an opportune moment for making it happen, such as a war." Now that the US is clearly in retreat, the need to act becomes even more urgent. If Israel finds itself without an ally that can supply it with capital and weapons, it will be almost impossible for it to reach its objectives. The fact that Israel feels like it needs to act fast led it to lash out with a vastly disproportionate assault on the Gaza Strip. With over 32,000 killed in 5 months, that's more civilians that died in 2 years of the Ukraine war. The US is highly aware of the fact that it needs to retreat from the Middle East so it can focus on China, but it can still save its position in the region through a proxy, Israel, by safeguarding its allies' position. So the US provided it with a carte blanche to do whatever it needs to do to secure the borders that it wants. Providing it with diplomatic cover at the UN, military assistance in the form of weapons and monetary support, and more, while the US is also deterring others in the region from intervening by placing 2 full carrier strike groups in the eastern Mediterranean. Now this is all very reasonable from a geopolitical perspective. It's just doing what it needs to do to safeguard its position in the region, its borders. It's clearly immoral what's happening, but that's a subject for a different video. But the big problem with this strategy is the whole world knows what's going on, but the US isn't even trying to hide its actions. Instead, the US claims impunity for both Israel and itself. In the short term, it allows both to achieve their objectives, but in the long run, this is highly damaging to US interests. As Robert Freeman said, collapsing power develops its own self-reinforcing dynamic. The fact that the US is declining leads it to double down on certain interests like the defense of Israel and set aside its morals in order to achieve short-term victories. But billions of people are seeing what's happening to the citizens of Palestine, leading them to question the US's position as the guarantor of global stability. How can one trust a policeman if the policeman is corrupt and only thinking of his own interests? The world is witnessing the intentional destruction of hospitals, schools, churches, mosques, relief agencies, escape convoys, and power stations. The shutting off of water supplies, electricity, medicine, and fuel, knowing that this will make Gaza uninhabitable. But in the meantime, the US is lobbying against even the smallest ceasefire. The peak of economic vitality is one thing. Military impotence and diplomatic ineptness are others that the US still might survive. But it is the moral collapse, obvious to the whole world to see, that's causing the US the most damage. It means the US won't be able to credibly claim to be the leader of the world. The US used to at least act like it was interested in doing the right thing. Now it's so desperate to hold on to power in the region that it's willing to lose all credibility in order to save the little power that it has left. Let me leave you with these words from Robert Freeman. The US bumbles along, intoxicated with the childish delusion of its exceptionalism and its rosy remembrance of its once great glorious past. It is instead like a snowball careening down a mountainside, oblivious of its path, heedless of its destructive out-of-control nature, and picking up mass and momentum as it hurtles down its own demise. What lies at the bottom is impossible to know, but it will not be pretty. So that was it for today's video, guys. You can find the article that inspired this video by Robert Freeman in the description down below. Leave a comment and let me know what you think. Is the US really in decline, or am I exaggerating? Is a disproportionate assault by Israel a symptom of US decline, or are those things completely unrelated? Leave a like if you enjoyed the content, subscribe if you want to see more. I'll be uploading videos every Sunday. See you in the next one.